recently I spent 5 wonderful days in Leeds, England. I was invited there by Bishop Arthur Roach to speak to the priests and to the lay people of the diocese, and also to speak at the university. And it was a tremendous trip. I went up to Durham while I was there to see the great early medieval cathedral there. I went to York as well, saw the York Minster Cathedral, one of the gems of English architecture. But neither Durham Cathedral nor the York Minster were the most beautiful things I saw when I was there. I went to the much more modest Cathedral of Leeds, and Bishop Roach invited me to crouch down in front of the altar, and then he pulled out 2 stones to reveal in the altar, behind glass, 2 very well-preserved human skulls. They're the remains of Blessed Peter Snow and Blessed Ralph Grimston. They were 2 figures during the Elizabethan period. So around the time of Shakespeare, 1590s, Peter Snow was a priest who had been trained in Reims, been trained in France, because of course during that time it was a capital offense to be a priest and to say Mass and to minister to Catholics. Peter Snow had been smuggled into England, and he ministered, they think, for 2, perhaps 3 years. Under probably terrible conditions. Priests had to say Mass clandestinely, to minister to people, to catechize. They were hidden away in attics and basements, sometimes holed up in holes in the wall. He lived under those kind of grim conditions for 2, maybe 3 years. Then in the May of 1598, he was making his way to York, which is not too far from Leeds. He was in the company of Ralph Grimston, who was a layman, a slightly older man, who was there to protect him. But they were waylaid by the authorities, and we know from the record that Ralph Grimston pulled his sword to defend the young priest and told the priest to ride away, but they were captured. They were brought to York. They were both tried, and Ralph Grimston was executed by being hanged and then beheaded. But the young priest was given a far worse punishment. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered. So hanged to within a few inches of his life, and then he was eviscerated and then cut into 4 pieces. His head too was put on a gate over or put on a pike over the gates going into the city of York. The skulls were taken down. They were preserved by Catholics. Think of the head of Thomas More was preserved by his daughter, for many years. They eventually found their way to a Carmelite monastery not far from Leeds. And then for many, many centuries they were there. In recent years, that monastery was sold to a hotelier. And Bishop Roach knew about these skulls, and he knew that they were still there in this building, and he wanted to preserve them. So he arranged to have them removed from this monastery. But before he ensconced them in the altar in Leeds, he sent them to a forensic scientist in London who specializes in the reconstruction of faces, for murder cases. And they put the skulls through MRIs and various machines. And then the scientists made these remarkable reconstructions of what these 2 men look like. Ralph Grimston, you see, is this man in his late 40s. But I was especially struck by the face of the young priest, Peter Snow, who died at the age of 32. He looks for all the world like one of my students at Mundelein. If you changed his hair just a little bit and put him in 21st century dress, he could be walking down the hallway at Mundelein. This young kid. What struck me was the extraordinary cruelty of that time. What made possible that kind of activity, that you would arrest, you'd convict, and you would brutally put to death someone who had the courage to come over to say Mass and to catechize. What you saw there, what I saw in those 2 skulls, was the worst of the human condition. The worst that we human beings can come up with, that kind of cruelty that this young man had to endure. But above all, I found myself edified by his witness. During his years of study in France, he knew exactly what he was preparing for. He knew the fate that probably awaited him, and yet he went. During those terrible years when he was living under very grim circumstances, he persevered. Looking into that placid face, I couldn't help but think what God's amazing grace can do to transfigure our lives and to raise us to heroic levels of sanctity, love, compassion. Part of the genius of Catholic anthropology is that we can make sense of both sides of the human condition. There is nothing naive or blandly optimistic about Catholic anthropology. We take original sin and its effects with utter seriousness. Chesterton said, "We're all in the same boat and we're all seasick." Catholic anthropology can handle, can understand Auschwitz, Hiroshima, the Cambodian killing fields, or Elizabethan totalitarianism. We understand that kind of brutality. We make sense of it. At the same time, Catholic anthropology knows that we are made in the image and likeness of God, and knows that under the influence of grace, we can be transfigured into an almost angelic level of love, compassion, virtue. As I look at those two skulls and the altar it leads, I think Catholic teaching, Catholic anthropology, can make full sense of that story, both the dark side and the light side of it.